Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. My name is Yadi Caro, and in each episode, I address a new skill with the help of an expert. Remember that you can get more resources and listen to previous episodes via my website, hardcoresoftsskillspodcast.com. Today, we talk about hiring with Dr. Paul Spector. If you have a team or a company, what are some of the considerations to take when assessing if you have a capable candidate? Also, what areas should you avoid when conducting an assessment? And if you are not hiring, what are some ways to cultivate talent from within? My guest will provide answers to these questions. Dr. Paul Spector is an IO psychologist and industrial organizational psychologist who has studied topics such as the impact of jobs on the behavior and well-being of employees, counterproductive work behavior, job satisfaction, and job stress. He's written books on both methodology and content, including an IO psychology textbook, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Research and Practice. Let's listen. Well, thank you so much, Paul Spector, for being here with me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So there's a lot of questions I want to ask you about, and particularly in soft skills from an industrial organizational perspective, because you're an IO psychologist. Also, get to understand more about your work because you have published various books. You're a prolific writer and blogger, and every time you publish something new about interesting information right now in the IO world. So I want to get started asking, why did you decide to focus on the field of IO psychology?
Well, I started college, I was a physics major, and then my freshman year, the guy down the hall said he'd sell me his IO an intro to psychology textbook really cheap, and that it was a good, easy elective. So I took him up on the offer. I took the course. I really liked it. And then the next semester, I changed my major to psychology. And I'm glad I did. Psychology compared to physics was the wild frontier. There was so little that had been done and so much that needed to be done. So it was just a much more exciting field for me. And then my senior year, I took an IO course, an intro to IO, and I really liked it. And what appealed to me at the time, I was working with a social psychologist, and I really liked social psychology. And it seemed to me that IO gave the opportunity of studying social psychology topics in an actual field setting in the workplace. And so that's been a lot of my focus through my career, is looking at topics that you really could consider applied social, because it's looking at social behavior in the environment where it actually occurs.
Well, that's fascinating. Switching from physics, kind of like fortune, stumbling into IO psychology. And you mentioned in terms of some of the topics at the time, it was a Wild West. Could you explain what are some of the misconceptions of psychology right now? And from that perspective, helping people, listeners, understand what IO psychology really is about.
Well, I was in graduate school in the early and mid 70s. And at that time, the field was very much focused on maximizing performance of employees. So, the big topics were things like selection and assessing employees, training. There was some motivation and leadership and some really core topics. But a lot of what's in IO psychology today really didn't exist in those days. So this entire focus on employee well-being and taking the employee perspective is fairly new. The origins of it, you can find an odd piece here and there going back before, say, the 1990s, but there wasn't very much of it. And so after the 80s, it really started picking up. So there's still a misconception that IO psychologists are the tool of management, and that IOs only care about squeezing the most productivity out of people. But if that was ever true about the field, it's certainly not true today. There are some individuals who are in roles where maybe they're only trying to hire the best people to maximize performance, but IO is so much more than that. And you find IO psychologists in practice doing all sorts of things, getting into occupational health and safety, getting into employee well-being, into work-family balance issues, and all kinds of things that, while they're good for employers, a lot of it is focused very much on the well-being of employees.
That's interesting. From that, it has shifted, I guess, from an industrial side of things, measuring, and I remember that kind of in terms of research in how it was used in the military as well too. How has the practices of that specific part of the assessment for either productivity or for hiring people, how has that changed in this past 30, 40 years in the field of psychology?
Originally, the assessment was focused mainly on predicting performance, job performance, productivity. It hasn't been very long since this started to shift. And so I remember hearing from consultants that they've been doing projects trying to predict accidents and safety and looking at trying to predict well-being. And of course, the military is very interested in predicting who's going to be resilient and resistant to trauma. And so they're not just focused on who can perform the best, but who's going to be the best fit. You have police departments looking at the same thing: who can best deal with stress? And so that's been somewhat of a shift over time to be looking more at the focused on the employee, not just as a cog and a performer, but really looking at the employee more broadly.
And currently, what are some of the uses when it comes to hiring employees? How is it used right now?
I have psychologists who get involved with assessment for selection, often are attached to HR departments, and so they're mostly designing assessments. They might be designing tests or choosing tests. They might be doing job analysis to figure out what job requirements are. So what kinds of knowledge and skill does a person need to be successful in a job? And then what's the best way to go about assessing that knowledge and skill? So it could be, they're all online these days. So they're very quick, very easy, very cheap, especially if you designed your own test for a company. The applicant logs in, takes the assessment, gets a score, and then you can screen. But there are lots of other ways of assessing people. There are structured interviews. There are all kinds of simulations. Sometimes a simulation can be a single exercise. Sometimes it could be an assessment center that takes place over 2 or 3 days. A lot depends on what the particular type of job is. If it's a leadership position, it might be worth investing in an entire assessment center. For other jobs, let's say entry-level jobs, probably it's not worth that kind of investment because it's pretty expensive to have to run an assessment center for 2 or 3 days.
What makes a good assessment when used to hire people? What are some of the aspects? Understanding it varies case by case, but what are some of the basic elements that a good assessment should have?
It starts with the job analysis. It starts with analyzing the job to figure out what are the skills and abilities people need. What's the knowledge that they need? What talents does it take to do this job? Then you look to either find or develop assessments that can tap into the things that are job relevant. It really gets complicated. It's a very technical business to develop tests. So you start off by defining, okay, I want to measure this particular skill. Then you have to think about what's the best way to measure that skill. If it's a cognitive skill, then maybe a paper and pencil test, or maybe it should be now a mouse click test is the best type of assessment. If it's an interpersonal skill, then maybe you want to do some kind of an interpersonal exercise. You can pick some of that up in a properly structured interview or some other simulation. Sometimes you put two people together, have them do a role play, and that's a good way to assess an interpersonal skill. But a lot depends. It's really the front end work that's the most important. Figuring out what exactly you need to assess, what's the best way to assess it. Then you develop your assessment. You collect data on the use of that assessment to make sure that it is consistent in what it's measuring. If you measure the same person twice, you're going to get pretty much the same score. And whether it relates to anything that's job relevant. So you could develop an assessment because you think it's going to work. And then when you try to tie it to something, tie it to performance, tie it to how well the person adjusts to the job, tie it to whether they stay on the job, retention. If it doesn't relate to those things, then you shouldn't be using it because it's not accomplishing what you want it to accomplish.
And what are some of the wrong uses of those assessments that you have seen?
I would say first, it's using the wrong test. Somebody thinks, well, we want our employees to be smart, so we're going to use a cognitive ability test. But it's not relevant because the job doesn't have a heavy cognitive skill load. And so maybe it's more of a manual labor job. And I've heard of this happening where maybe the CEO says, I want to use a cognitive ability test because I want to be sure all employees are smart. And that, cognitive ability doesn't always predict performance in a job. And so you shouldn't be using it if it doesn't predict. So that's one thing, using the wrong thing. And the other is using tests that are not very good, what we call good psychometric properties, that it's consistent in measures and that it actually does a good job of measuring what it is you're after. So you might have a test that looks like it ought to be a good test of a particular skill, but the reality is it doesn't really measure it. Maybe the items are poorly written. It's got some wrong item content in it. Just a variety of things can go wrong when you go to develop a test.
When it comes to doing these assessments, because let's say I'm a manager, I'm in a small company, we don't have an IO psychologist or somebody in HR in charge of doing that. What do you recommend that the people do to kind of try to integrate those practices if I'm in a small company?
I think in a small company, if you don't have the expertise or someone in your company has the expertise, it's best to get a consultant to at least give you some advice. If you can't afford to hire someone to do it all for you, at least you could get a consultant that maybe reviews your plan at the beginning and then maybe reviews what you've done at the end to help keep you on track. IO psychologists are specifically trained in this sort of thing, but there are people in other fields too that might be very well trained in how to develop assessments and how to use them in companies. But you need to be very careful because there are a lot of pitfalls. There's, of course, the issue of whether you're measuring the right thing, whether your test really reflects what you want it to measure, whether it relates to something. But there's also the entire area of potential discrimination, because sometimes tests, certain groups will do better than other groups. Maybe men do better on a strength test than women do. And then you get into the issue of, is it fair to use the test? This gets into complicated legal issues. By and large, if you can show that the test is job relevant, the use of the test. So if it's a strength test, but it's clear that strength is really important, and you can demonstrate that, then it may be okay to use the test. But if someone decides, well, I want my employees to be strong, and they decide to use a strength test and it's disadvantaging female applicants, they can get themselves into very serious legal trouble. And companies have been successfully sued for hundreds of millions of dollars over these kinds of issues. So it's something that needs to be taken very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've talked about good ways to measure those. How about for if I already have my team and I want to be able to kind of be as a manager, ensure my employees are skilled on those areas or prepare them to improve on those areas? How would you recommend to approach that for current employees in a company to help them become better at those interpersonal skills, be that conflict management, communication, and others?
Then we're getting more to the area of training. And so in that case, you can have a plan to get, to provide training. And you can build assessment into the training. So you could do an assessment, some kind of interpersonal skills assessment beforehand, put them through the training, and then at the end do another assessment just to determine whether or not the training is having the effect that you want.
Yeah, training, and that's absolutely essential. And it would be great if companies kind of or teams spend more time on those particular skills. And when it comes to other areas within IO psychology that you've seen in the workplace right now? What are some of the missing opportunities that you see that companies could take advantage of?
Traditionally, companies have used IOs mostly for assessment. I was taught in an IO PhD program for almost 40 years. And I've seen trends change over the years. So, our students would go out, and for a while, most of them were doing selection work, and a few of them were doing training. More recently, what I've seen is more and more of them are getting into totally different kinds of roles, having to do and with things like leadership, climate, culture, teams, occupational health and safety. And so those are areas that have been expanding. It's expanding opportunities for IO psychologists, but it's also expanding opportunities for companies that can utilize the talents of IOs to help them with a lot more than just hiring. Because you hire, but then you need to worry after you hire about what you're going to do with those people. Of course, training is one piece of it, but then you've got to worry about all of these other things. And particularly in this particular time where it's so hard to hire, the unemployment rate is so low that it's so hard to hire that companies really need to make the best of the people that they have. And by that, I don't mean getting the most productivity out of them. I mean in terms of engagement, retention, making sure people are well adapted to their jobs, they have good work-life balance. And if you want to be a competitive employer, you need to be seen as a place that's good to work for. And a lot of that has to do with how well you treat your employees. And so, these companies that get the best employer awards do so largely because of how they promote the well-being of their employees, their safety physically, their safety psychologically, their work-life balance, and in general, that they're treated fairly and treated well. And those employees are likely to talk to friends, and they can get friends that want to work there. And as the reputation grows, people just want to work for that place.
Yeah, great points in terms of making sure. Absolutely, the hiring right now is so difficult. And in company I'm working for right now, trying to get people to positions that you will think like, oh, this an obvious choice for everybody, but it's so difficult. And in terms of the talking about productivity, there's still a lot of tendencies, I guess, to measure the productivity of employees,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in remote work environments. What are some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to measuring productivity that companies
Mm-hmm.
and our teams should consider?
Well, productivity is vital because without productivity, the company doesn't survive and employees all lose their jobs. So it's really important, but it needs to be balanced. But it depends on the nature of the work. Some work has measurable production. So factory work, sales. A lot of these kinds of jobs have measurable production. But all jobs, really, you can think in terms of performance, some more countable than others. So it's good to have a system of performance tracking, but you can think in terms of performance appraisal as having multiple purposes. One is really documentation for administrative reasons. If someone's not performing, you need to document so you can put them on a performance improvement plan. And ultimately, if they can't do what they need to do, then you've got everything documented when you let them go. But beyond that, it's a motivational tool. And that is, through coaching and feedback, which should be continual. It's not a once a year thing or a twice a year thing. It should be a continual thing. So as you assess people's performance and their behavior, they can get feedback, they can get coaching, and over time you can increase their engagement, increase their motivation, increase their success. And as people have success, success tends to be motivational. So if you bring in someone and you coach them and provide feedback and help them get better and better and develop skills, and maybe show them the career path. So if you get these sets of skills and you prove yourself, then you're eligible to move up or move into this other role. that maybe you like better. And so that's very motivational for people.
How should coaching be done? Because when sometimes we're hired for jobs, so we hire people for jobs, we don't really think about that part, the development part, or we send them to a training, but we don't think in terms of like coaching the employee. What are some of the ways that employees could be coached, and that, or some of the best practices when it comes to coaching within the job?
A big part of any supervisor's job is paying attention to their direct reports, seeing what they're doing, assessing, even if it's not formal, assessing their behavior and their performance, and then just providing feedback and doing it in a constructive way. Keep in mind that you don't wait a month and then have a list of 10 things and blast people with 10 things. When something comes up, deal with it as it happens. So if you're supervising sales employees and you observe an interaction with a customer and you notice something isn't quite right, when the customer is gone, call the person aside in private and give them feedback. Talk about it. Say, I want to talk about what just happened with this customer, and give them tips, give them advice, not in a punishing way, in a punitive way, but in a, I want you to be better way. I want you to be a star. I want you to be better. And I'm going to give you this feedback. And don't be shy about giving praise, showing appreciation. So the next time maybe you observe it, and maybe the employee did what you suggested, well, acknowledge it. Say, that was much better. Let's talk about it. Did you feel it was better? How do you think it worked? How do you think it was better? And let the person say, well, I tried it your way, but I think this other way might even be better. And say, fine, let's try it. And so that's the way you coach people. The message has to be, I'm here to help you. I want you to be successful, and I'm going to do what I can. You can come to me if you need help. And if I notice something, I'll give you feedback.
That's great that if companies will build that into, or teacher will build that into their particular status quo, because either as a manager coaching other people is very rewarding, and you feel as an employee that you get the support you need to kind of help you go to the next level in your career.
And as a manager, it's rewarding for you to see the results of your coaching. So it doesn't always come naturally to everybody. Some people just don't instantly take to it. But as a manager, you can train managers to do this. And as a manager, when you start trying it and you see that it works, that's very rewarding and very motivating.
Absolutely. In terms of, I must ask about soft skills in general. What are
Mm-hmm.
some of the particular skills that you consider that should be assessed or integrated more into the jobs right now? What are those key skills that you consider should be part of like the must-haves in any organization?
Number one is communication. So verbal communication, written communication, um, how to communicate with other people, how to listen, basically be the receiver of communication, um, how to be, with so much communication being virtual, there's a whole set of skills in virtual communication. Um, it may seem silly, but people need training in how to write polite emails, because people try to use humor and sarcasm in emails, and often it comes across as offensive.
Hmm.
So you have to learn that if you're on the phone, you can joke. If you're in person, maybe on a Zoom call, but don't joke in an email, because it just doesn't work. It's generally not funny and it doesn't come across as you intended. So there are a lot of those sorts of elements that are important. And so companies, would do well to provide skill training in communication. Teamwork is another thing. It's not always easy to work in teams. You have to coordinate with other people. Sometimes there's conflicts. Sometimes there are people in the team that don't like each other. And so that's a whole set of team skills that need to be trained, particularly in people who are not used to it. And of course, on the leader side, there's all those leadership skills that are not necessarily, people don't necessarily come naturally to them. I I think there's three groups of people. There are people who just are extremely talented leaders, They come in and they're wonderful leaders. They've got it. You have a group in the middle of people who have the potential to be good leaders, but they haven't learned how to do it yet. And so they're a good group to give lots of training to. And then you have people who probably they're not cut out to be leaders, and they probably shouldn't be, because no matter what kind of training they do, they just don't seem to be able, for a variety of reasons, to be really successful leaders. They can get in a leadership position, but they may be abusive to people. They don't know how to treat people very well. They just have issues that make it very difficult for them to work with people in a constructive way. Unfortunately, they sometimes get into those roles, and the people who work for them have to suffer with them. Sometimes it seems like the work's getting done, but you might have high turnover. Maybe there's productivity, but it could be a lot better if the people had a better leader.
Yeah, great that you mentioned that in terms of the leaders that are the three types of leaders, the leaders that are natural, the ones in training, and those like want to reconsider. They could be happier probably in another role that is not a leadership role either. Before we go, things that you are excited about on the IO psychology field, what are some of those things that you're excited about to see in terms of this field right now?
Probably what I'm most excited to see is the expanding of different kinds of roles that IOs have been getting into more and more over the last maybe 10 years. It's probably a long-term trend, but I've really noticed it in the last 10 years. So thinking about some of my most recent students, they're in roles that are not selection, they're not training, but they're in very different areas. And as I mentioned before, leadership development, climate, culture, having to do with safety, having to do with a lot of topics that in some cases, really didn't even exist when I was in graduate school. And so it's great to see the field expanding and so many different kinds of opportunities that IOs can take on.
And as a student in IO psychology myself, I'm very excited about all the things that I'm learning and all the possibilities I see in the field. So it is a very wide and exciting field too. And if for people who wanted to get in contact with you, what's the best way to reach you?
Probably to find out more about me, just go to my website, paulspector.com. And as far as an email, maybe the best email is my university email, which is pspector@usf.edu.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all your information and your time. This great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening today. Before you leave, make sure you go to my website, hardcoresoftskillspodcast.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Then go to the review tab and leave a review. It is the way to ensure this podcast is discovered by others. Remember that by learning soft skills, you make your hard skills work for you. See you next time.